November 4th, 1922. The Valley of the Kings, Egypt. British archaeologist Howard Carter stood in the scorching desert heat, watching his Egyptian workers clear away ancient rubble. He was 48 years old, exhausted and nearly out of time. For 6 long years, he had searched this valley for a tomb that most experts believed didn't exist. He had found nothing. His wealthy sponsor, Lord Carnarvon, had spent a fortune funding the expedition and was ready to quit. This was Carter's final season, his last chance. In just a few days, he would have to admit defeat and abandon the dream he'd chased for decades. Then, on that ordinary November morning, something extraordinary happened. A young Egyptian water boy, whose name has been lost to history, was digging a hole to place water jars when his tool struck something solid. He called out to the foreman. Workers rushed over and began carefully clearing sand. Within minutes, they uncovered a stone step cut into the bedrock. Then another step, and another. Carter's heart must have been pounding as he watched 12 steps emerge from the sand, leading down to a sealed doorway bearing the royal seals of the necropolis. But whose tomb was it? The seals were intact, meaning this tomb had not been robbed in over 3,000 years. That night, Carter sent one of the most famous telegrams in archaeological history to Lord Carnarvon in England. It read simply, "At last have made wonderful discovery in valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations." The greatest archaeological discovery of all time had begun. Howard Carter's journey to this moment had been long and difficult. Born in 1874 in London, Carter came from a modest family. His father was an artist who painted animals for wealthy clients. Young Howard showed artistic talent and never received formal education beyond basic schooling. At age 17, he was hired to travel to Egypt and copy tomb paintings and inscriptions for archaeological publications. This was how most archaeologists started in the Victorian era. Carter fell in love with Egypt immediately. He taught himself hieroglyphics. He learned Arabic. He became an expert in Egyptian archaeology through pure obsession and hands-on experience. By his 20s, he was working as an inspector of monuments in Luxor and the Valley of the Kings. But Carter had a stubborn, difficult personality. In 1905, he got into a confrontation with French tourists, refused to apologize, and was forced to resign. For several years, he barely survived, selling watercolor paintings to tourists. Then, in 1907, his luck changed. He was introduced to Lord Carnarvon, a wealthy British aristocrat who had come to Egypt to recover from a car accident and had developed a passion for archaeology. Carnarvon needed an expert to manage excavations. Carter needed funding. They formed a partnership that would change history. For 5 years, from 1917 to 1922, they excavated in the Valley of the Kings, searching specifically for the tomb of a minor pharaoh named Tutankhamun. Most Egyptologists thought Tutankhamun's tomb had already been found and robbed in antiquity. Carter refused to believe it. He had discovered some small objects bearing Tutankhamun's name and was convinced the intact tomb was still hidden somewhere in the valley. But after 6 seasons of digging, moving thousands of tons of sand and rubble, he had found nothing. After Carter sent his telegram, he had to wait 2 agonizing weeks for Lord Carnarvon to travel from England to Egypt by ship and train. Carter spent those weeks guarding the site night and day, terrified that tomb robbers might discover his find. Finally, on November 23rd, Lord Carnarvon arrived with his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert. On November 24th, with Carnarvon and witnesses present, Carter's workers cleared the entire staircase, revealing a sealed doorway at the bottom. The door bore royal seals with Tutankhamun's name. Carter later wrote that his hands were shaking. This was it, the tomb of the boy king. But had it already been robbed? There were signs that ancient thieves had broken through and the door had been resealed. Carter's team carefully dismantled the doorway and found themselves in a sloping corridor filled with limestone chips and rubble, evidence that ancient officials had deliberately filled it to deter robbers. It took 2 more days to clear the corridor. At the end was another sealed doorway, also showing signs of ancient break-ins and resealing. This meant robbers had entered the tomb in antiquity, but had they taken everything? On November 26, 1922, Carter made a small hole in the upper left corner of the door and held up a candle. Hot air rushed out from the tomb, making the candle flame flicker. As Carter's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw something that took his breath away. Lord Carnarvon, standing behind him in the narrow passage, couldn't stand the suspense. He asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter later wrote that he could barely speak. Finally, he whispered words that became immortal. Yes, wonderful things. Wonderful things everywhere. What he saw in that first glimpse was the antechamber of Tutankhamun's tomb, a room about 12 by 26 feet, piled from floor to ceiling with treasures. There were 3 golden couches shaped like fantastic animals. There were chariots covered in gold. There were alabaster vases, ebony and ivory chairs, carved wooden statues of the king and gods, boxes of jewelry, weapons, sandals, clothing, board games, flowers that still retain some color after 3,000 years. Everything was jumbled together because ancient robbers had ransacked the room, though they had clearly been interrupted and the tomb resealed. The next day, Carter and Carnarvon officially entered the antechamber. The sight was overwhelming. Carter wrote, "We felt like intruders. We were but atoms in that vast scheme of time." Between 2 life-size guardian statues, Carter discovered a sealed doorway leading to the burial chamber. But he and Carnarvon made a controversial decision. Rather than immediately entering the burial chamber, they would first spend months carefully cataloging and removing every object from the antechamber. This would protect the scientific value of the discovery. It took Carter and his team nearly 2 months just to photograph, catalog, and safely remove the contents of the antechamber. Finally, on February 16, 1923, in front of invited dignitaries and press from around the world, Carter dismantled the sealed doorway to the burial chamber. What he found inside defied imagination. The entire room was filled, wall to wall, by an enormous gilded shrine covered in hieroglyphics and religious scenes. It was so large it nearly touched the chamber walls. And it was the first of 4 nested shrines, each inside the other like Russian dolls, protecting the king's sarcophagus. Opening and documenting the nested shrines took an entire year. Inside the 4th and final shrine, Carter found a massive quartzite sarcophagus. Inside the sarcophagus were 3 nested coffins. The outer 2 were made of gilded wood. The innermost coffin was solid gold, weighing over 200 pounds. And inside that golden coffin, wrapped in linen bandages, was the mummy of King Tutankhamun, his face covered by the most famous artifact in Egyptian archaeology, the Golden Death Mask. Made of 24 pounds of solid gold inlaid with lapis lazuli, carnelian, and colored glass. The mask is one of the most beautiful objects ever created. But even as the discovery brought Carter worldwide fame, tragedy struck. In March 1923, just 4 months after the tomb's opening, Lord Carnarvon was bitten by a mosquito in Cairo. He accidentally cut the bite while shaving, and it became infected. In an era before antibiotics, the infection became septic. On April 5, 1923, Carnarvon died in his Cairo hotel room at age 57. Legend says that at the moment of his death, all the lights in Cairo mysteriously went out, and back in England, Carnarvon's dog howled and dropped dead. The newspapers exploded with stories of the pharaoh's curse. Some claim Carter had found an inscription warning that death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king, though no such inscription actually existed. Over the next few years, several people connected to the tomb died, fueling curse hysteria. But Carter himself, who spent more time in the tomb than anyone, lived until 1939, dying of lymphoma at age 64. Most of the people who entered the tomb lived normal lifespans. The curse was media sensationalism, not supernatural reality.